The last section of our textbook chapter is called The Other Humans and Us. So we talked about the Homo sapiens, the anatomically modern and the behaviorally modern Homo sapiens coming out from Africa. But we still have other species around that are part of the genus Homo. We called them Middle Pleistocene Homo in the last class, sometimes referred to as archaic Homo sapiens or old style Homo sapiens. And in this section, we look at some of these other closely related species, which they are calling the other humans and us, and what happened to them and how the emerging Homo sapiens interacted with them. Now, the one thing I want to caution you here is that if we rewound the clock to say 40,000 years ago, when we say us, it's not like if we went back 40,000 years ago, we'd be like, aha, Neanderthal, that doesn't look like me. But yes, early modern Homo sapiens, I like that guy. We would probably equally go ew to both of them. In other words, they were much more similar to each other than either one of them would be to us. It's not like we'd go back and be like, yeah, I want to start a family with those early Homo sapiens, but the Neanderthals, they turned me off. Not exactly. You'd probably be yucky. They'd probably both of them be yucky to you. Again, we talk about behavioral modernity, but they all would have looked pretty weird to us back then. So just when we say us and these other humans, we're projecting back in time in a way that's a little bit anachronistic. The Neanderthals are the most famous of our groups here. Everybody's heard of the Neanderthals. They emerged from a Homo erectus lineage that had spread out earlier, probably around 400 to 500,000 years ago. They occur across Eurasia. They were named the Neanderthals because the first of them, the first skeletons of them, were discovered in the Neander Valley in Germany. Tal is the German word for valley. In old style German, it was spelled in English as Thal. In new style German, it's as Tal. So sometimes you see different spelling variations. When they first dug up these skeletons, they thought they were directly ancestral to Homo sapiens, but it turns out they are not. They're not directly ancestral to modern humans. They seem to have coexisted, and they were adapted to some of these cold climate areas. In terms of their bodies, they were stronger, probably, stockier, big face and noses, probably more of a Neanderthal or a human than you ever want to see, really, but there they are, or what we deduce they would have looked like. Curiously, I don't know if we still do this anymore, but in the old days, we used to insult people. Yeah, brawn over brains because we think of them as stupid. The funny thing is that actually their brains, in terms of just pure size of the brain, are larger on average than the Homo sapiens. Does that mean they were smarter? No, not necessarily. Your textbook says that this is probably simply a scaling effect in relation to the larger body mass that they had, and not necessarily an indication that their brains were organized in the same way. So this is not necessarily, and that's why you always have to be careful. Again, we make broad comparisons in terms of cranium size and head size, but you always have to correlate that to body size and also to brain organization. They might have been pretty smart too. In fact, they had a lot of cool stuff. They were able probably to control fire, like we talked about with Middle Pleistocene Homo. They could cook, get some warmth out of it. They did a decent amount of hunting, and they even had their own tool style called the Mousterian tool style, which they were able to make cool looking tools. So they were pretty adapted to cold climate areas and had a pretty good run across this range of Eurasia. However, What we don't see is evidence of fitted clothing. That's right. Bing! No fitted clothing among the Neanderthals. They're probably using animal skins and other things. What else was limiting with the Neanderthals? Their movement and travel. So they'd expanded into a pretty wide range, but their population size was smaller in these areas. They don't seem to have traded as much across their networks as the Homo sapiens were. And so you had rather limited gene flow, less genetic diversity, less swapping of ideas, and less trading around. And so they tended to be in these more localized areas as in comparison to the Homo sapiens that were coming into these regions. Now, some people get really into the Neanderthals. There's some evidence, for example, that they may have intentionally buried their dead. Talk about that when we get to the chapter on death and dying. There's some evidence that they also were able to care for individuals who had been hurt, so it patch them up and continue to keep them in the group instead of just moving along and leaving them to be. So they seem to have some evidence for a social structure. They have body decorations, made jewelry, necklaces, and people think that that indicates that they probably had at least some language abilities. Might not have been the same as Homo sapiens. Well, probably definitely not the same, but probably indicated. And maybe even a sense of self or being able to understand themselves as a group or as individuals. It's hard to say. And it's also hard to say because is it possible that there was learning exchange between the Homo sapiens that were coming in and interacting with these Neanderthals? Did the Homo sapiens help teach them to make necklaces or things like that? Or it could have been the other way around as well. But these are a pretty sophisticated human group. In recent years, or at least in 2010, we have found genetic evidence of a cousin group to the Neanderthals that we call the Denisovans. They are named because the bones that we got the genetics from were found in Denisova Cave in Siberia. And again, it took some very sophisticated genetic evidence to figure this out, but they seem to be a related species to the Neanderthals, but they are not exactly the same. And they seem to have lived mostly on the eastern part of the range, so mostly in the Asian area. There is not a lot of archaeological evidence for the Denisovans. Most of what we have is mainly from the genetics. But what it seems like is that you had, again, we talked about these Middle Pleistocene Homo groups splitting out. And so it seems like there was a shared ancestor for both the Denisovans and Neanderthals around 400 to 500,000 years ago, let's say. So both of these groups were adapted to their areas, did a lot of cool things, maybe especially the Neanderthals that we know about. And so there's been a lot of speculation about what exactly happened to these Neanderthals and Denisovans. And for a long time, it looked like the Neanderthals and Denisovans had, or especially the Neanderthals, had completely disappeared. And so people thought that, in fact, they were a completely separate species to Homo sapiens. And there was accumulating evidence, as we saw in the assimilation model, that Homo sapiens had simply replaced all of these groups. They were not, certainly not ancestral. However, what do we know now? What did we do with these Neanderthals? So there is evidence now, and it took, again, some very sophisticated genetics to finally untangle this. The evidence suggests that there was interbreeding with the Denisovans and the Neanderthals, and probably some other groups that we don't know about yet. So other archaic or old Homo groups in that area. Now, the way we have found this is that we have found that we share some genetics, modern humans today, now we can say we, in various degrees with both Neanderthals and Denisovans. So primarily people who have ancestry in the area of across Europe and Asia, that seems to be where there's Neanderthal interbreeding. Again, most of this probably occurred in what is now the Middle East. So before people started to populate both Europe and Asia. But in both European and Asian populations, you have up to 4% Neanderthal ancestry. Now, most of these genes don't seem to do much. As your textbook says, they don't seem to affect smartness or language use, but it is possible that they do influence some other traits. Now, again, this is recent stuff, and I would not, a lot of dumb stuff has been, a lot of speculation has been made about this, like Neanderthals gave me COVID or Neanderthals gave me asthma. I would caution any direct influence. As we saw, the genetic stuff is very complicated. And so there's evidence that there is both Denisovan and Neanderthal ancestry genetically to varying degrees in different human populations. But I would caution you about the implications. We may know more later on, but for now, we just know that they interbred. And what that means is that, as your textbook puts it, some of these other humans are still a part of us. So in our Homo sapien lineage, when we look genetically, we are a mosaic or a complex mixture of some of these hominin groups. And the way in which this happened is known as, it's not necessarily that they were freely intermixing with these other related species. It's known as genetic introgression, where you get some interbreeding over time that leaves a more enduring mark in the DNA. So it's very exciting. It's interesting stuff to think about and learn about. But I do want to stress that even though there's been this introgression, that as of about 35,000 years ago, the only bipedal hominins are the Homo sapiens. So all these other groups do disappear, and we are left with Homo sapiens as this one interbreeding species across these continents. And as we talked about with the small sample, once these other groups disappear, Homo sapiens are not interacting with as large a range of other creatures as possible. So everybody today gets excited about immigrants and diversity and people who look different. That we don't interact with anybody who would have looked as different as some of these early Homo sapiens interacting with these more different bipedals. And as we talked about, the human phenotypes that we see and we get excited about in terms of ideas of race or cultural difference are things that emerged pretty recently, evolutionarily speaking, within the last 30, 40, sometimes even as many as 10, 5,000 years. I want to talk about a few populations that also existed and are part of the Homo species, but there is no evidence that there is interbreeding or genetic signature from some of these groups. They're just cool. So you may have seen these folks on TV. Homo naledi, which is a small-bodied and relatively small-brained Homo variety that seems to have lived in the southern African region from about 200 to 340,000 years ago. We've found some of the most complete skeletons of these creatures, and so it's very exciting in some ways. They're helping to redefine our ideas of the mosaic of human evolution because they have things that look very Homo sapien-like, but they're combined with other elements which, again, give us a sense of a mosaic of traits. There's another super cool species. Again, no evidence of interbreeding, but they're just exciting. Yes, they've also been called the hobbits. These are technically known as Homo floresiensis because they were found on Flores Island. Again, this is a part of Indonesia, so it seems to have been the remnant of an early Homo erectus migration. They're about 3 feet tall with pretty small brains, seem to have made it up to about 60,000 years ago. Their smallness seems to be a result of what is called insular dwarfism, or what can happen on islands when you don't have much interaction with other creatures over time, as the creatures can get smaller on an island. And so there's been a lot of debates about how these, is this a separate species? Again, there's no indication there was interbreeding with other human populations, but they are another example of how different Homo species were able to spread out and do cool things in other places. So we have these other hominins coming out. I want to also revisit some other primate species that we didn't get to talk about before, but just to give you a sense of a review of some of these main aspects of what distinguishes Homo sapiens from other groups. So we talk about Homo floresiensis, the little hobbit people, that would be on the very small side. This is an example of a primate named Gigantopithecus. Gigantopithecus was a huge ape-like primate which lived mainly in China at about 300,000 years ago. It was there for a while and then died out. I bring up Gigantopithecus just to indicate that if we rewound the clock of evolution and you went back 300,000 years ago and you said, which of these hominin species is likely to make it? You might have said, I'm going with Gigantopithecus. Those guys are big and strong and well adapted, but they go extinct. In some ways, you might say they were perhaps too well adapted to their environment. And then evolution is sometimes what we might call extinction of the fittest, not survival of the fittest. Another group that came out after the Australopiths was the genus Paranthropus, also known as the robust Australopithecines. And so we talked about the Australopiths and how they were being bipedal. There are also these robust Australopithecines that lived in Eastern Africa from around 2.7 million years ago up until 1 million years ago. And so they would have overlapped with some of the Homo erectus populations. And again, if you would have rewound the evolutionary clock, or if you would have gone back in time and looked at these groups, you might have been like, I'm going with those robust Australopithecines. Those guys are big, they're cool, they've made it, they're very adapted to their environment. What probably happened to them is, again, what I would call extinction of the fittest. You get too adapted to your environment, and then the environment changes, and then you aren't able to adapt and you go extinct. Similarly, if you rewound to the Neanderthals, you might be like, hey, those guys, they're bigger, they're stronger, they're more adapted to cold climates. They're the ones that are going to make it. Again, didn't make it. So you always have to be careful when we're telling the stories of human evolution, that you understand that we need a story or a narrative, as your textbook says, in order to place these fossil finds together. They also give you the example of having to do these facial reconstructions. When we dig up fossils, you can't tell what skin color is or how hairy someone is from their bones. And so you have to imagine what things might have been like. And you have to put these into visual and narrative stories. But what we want to be really careful with are what our textbook calls hero stories. The idea that the most and fittest and strongest and most well-adapted are the ones that are going to triumph in any situation. And a lot of these fossil finds have been fitted into this hero story of human evolution. What we need in some ways, and your textbook talks about this, again, this is doing a little bit of a review, but it's stuff that we didn't necessarily talk about before, is a greater diversity of people who do paleoanthropology. Because a lot of these fossil finds were fitted into this narrative of the triumphant white guy going out there and finding fossils and then telling this hero story of how these certain creatures survived. By getting different people into the mix, different ideas about this, we can actually get better interpretations and better understanding of what happened in the evolutionary record. So I know people are all down on diversity right now, but in fact, it's that diversity that gives us better understanding, better ideas about what happened than our previous stories. So in the very last section before our exam, your textbook talks about from our past, where we've come from, going to our futures. Crucial lessons. The environment has always been changing, and it will change. We're facing probably some of the most unprecedented changes in terms of our climate. Go outside today and bake in the sun, realize that our climate is indeed changing. Over time, Homo sapiens have adapted to that change, and there is hope for us that we will be able to adapt in the future. But I think that adaptation is only going to take place if we understand evolution correctly. So who have been the most successful creatures, evolutionary speaking? Not necessarily those who we would have expected as like super fit and super well adapted, but those creatures that are most open to being able to change, to being flexible in different environments. Those creatures who are able to incorporate more diverse perspectives and genetic diversity in their heritage. Again, going back to our very first lessons about evolution, evolution depends upon variation and diversity. You can't have natural selection if there's no diversity or variation to select from. Being able to migrate, being able to move to different places is one of the first things that made us human and enabled our expansion both within Africa and across our different ranges. Any time that human mobility and migration has been limited, it tends to be something that is detrimental to our species. People that get cut off and isolated tend to not do well in human evolution. As we talked about with the Neanderthals, it's hugely important that we be able to trade with each other, that we're interconnected, that we can swap ideas around, trade things, trade genes. This was crucial for the fact that Homo sapiens survived and these other creatures did not seem to be able to do as much trade and interconnection across the range. So when we think about the lessons that evolution teaches us, you can think about this in terms of what kinds of societies we're building today. Are we building resilient societies which will be able to face the changes ahead? I think evolutionarily speaking, the answers are pretty clear of the things that we should place a value on. Let's see how it goes.